Number 10, men's time of the month. Ancient Egypt was plagued with diseases. While the Egyptians were actually pretty advanced in terms of their medical sciences and cures for said diseases, there were still a bunch that people had no defense for. In particular, schistosomiasis infected nearly everyone at the time. This is an illness that makes people feel sick and causes our red to appear often in the toilet. It was actually so common that they didn't even realize it was a disease. Ancient Egyptians got schistosomiasis so often that they just thought it was a natural part of growing up. They accepted that men had to menstruate just like women do, and they accepted the red vino on tap coming out of their bodies was a normal part of growing up. Number 9. Kinda rude. In ancient Egypt, those born with dwarfism were actually well accepted in society. Their recorded daily activities suggest assimilation into daily life, and their disorder was not shown as a physical handicap. Wisdom writings and moral teachings in ancient Egypt commanded respect for dwarves and other individuals with disabilities. But one thing I read online suggested that if you were born with dwarfism, you certainly did not have to worry about unemployment. Usually, this is because in ancient Egypt, little people were often hired to work in security-sensitive jobs, specifically those who worked with gold. This didn't actually apply only to those with dwarfism, but others with obvious physical characteristics that helped them stand out. These people were considered to be the best candidates for this kind of work because if a worker stole anything, they were very easily found and promptly arrested. Number 8, me and all my friends. Every time a First Dynasty king bit the dust back in ancient Egypt, a whole lot of people went with him. Egyptians were famously almost more obsessed with their lives after they passed on than they were with their actual lives, and a passed away king needed his retinue to support him in the afterlife. It was a shocking show of power. For example, almost 600 other people were found buried with King Jur. When a king went, hundreds went with him, but those who were taken out this way would not necessarily feel that they were being unceremoniously taken. Those servants who were sent to bite the dust and be buried with their masters were considered privileged to be allowed to follow a powerful figure into the afterlife to serve them. However, it was still likely nerve-wracking to know that your fate was tied to the random passing of a person that you worked for. Egyptian royalty stopped this practice early in the First Dynasty, but it may have continued in a more innocent form, with the Egyptians burying mummies with little carved figurines that could magically serve the deceased in the afterlife. Number 7, sunburn. In ancient Egypt, one of the most awful crimes that you could commit was any form of offense or disrespect toward the sun god. If you vandalized or robbed a temple, committed any form of personal disrespect, or were otherwise found guilty of any offense related to the sun god, you were usually sentenced to be set on fire. This punishment was only reserved for the greatest of offenses and was usually accompanied by a ritual that committed the act to the gods. While the ancient Egyptians rarely practiced actual sacrifices, this was one of the few exceptions. While burning is painful enough to begin with, it was considered the most horrific way to go of all the ancient Egyptians because of the ritual significance of the act. They believed strongly in preserving the physical body for life after passing, and believed that destroying the person's physical body completely by burning would leave them with no vessel in the afterlife. Now, while the gods could still technically intervene to help this person out, it was about as terrifying a punishment as a believer in ancient Egyptian society could imagine. Number 6, sandwich paper. Okay, so this moment isn't actually from ancient Egypt, but it has to do with ancient Egypt, and it is pretty disturbing. There was a time in the early 1900s when anything involving ancient Egypt was considered a fad. Mummies were imported to Europe to be unwrapped at parties, and many mummies were illegally smuggled out of ancient Egypt. The truth is, there were a lot of mummies around, and no one really felt much respect for them. Even at the time, very little proper historical significance was attributed to them. For this reason, getting hold of mummy bandages was not only cheap, but in some cases, cheaper than paper. An enterprising businessman in the United States decided that he could save some money making wrapping paper for food, and imported some old brown mummy paper to do the trick. Unfortunately for him, his plan failed when people started catching cholera, and the use of mummy paper to wrap food was promptly abandoned when it shouldn't have even started in the first place.
Number 5, exile. Exile as a form of punishment was applied in ancient Egypt for certain offenses. It involved banishing an individual from their community or region as a means of punishment and deterrent. Exile was one of the various punitive measures used in the legal systems of ancient Egypt. Exile served as several purposes in ancient Egypt, including punishment, deterrence, and the maintenance of social order. It was viewed as a way to remove individuals who had violated societal norms or committed offenses from the immediate community. The duration of the exile could vary, as some individuals might permanently be banished from their community, while others might face a specific time period of exile which they could actually return. But if you didn't have a calendar on you, it might be a bit tough for you to figure out when you were supposed to come back. Number 4. Retribution. Retribution in ancient Egypt was a concept embedded in the legal and social framework, particularly in cases of serious crimes such as death. Retribution was closely tied to the principles of justice, divine order, as we mentioned earlier, which is ma'at, the belief that the balance and harmony needed to be maintained in the universe. In cases of these killings, the principle of retribution was often applied. Family members of the victim might even have a say in determining the fate of the offender, sometimes seeking revenge or just accepting compensation. This compensation might also involve the offender providing goods, money, or other assets to the victim's family as a means of seeking forgiveness and restoring balance. Retribution was seen as a way of maintaining ma'at, which encompasses the concept of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Offenses against ma'at, particularly heinous crimes like killings, were believed to be upset the divine order and required corrective measures to restore harmony. Number 3. Corporal punishment. Like in all the ones listed above, there's one thing you need to know, and that there are no lawyers in ancient Egypt. A suspect was interrogated by the police, and the judge in court and witness were brought to testify for or against the accused. Since the prevailing belief that a person who had been charged was guilty until proven innocent, witnesses were often beaten to make sure that they were telling the truth. Once one has been charged with a crime, even if one was finally found innocent, one's name was still kept on record as having been a suspect. As such, public disgrace seems to have been a great deterrent as any other punishment. Even one that were completely exonerated of all wrongdoing, one would still be known as the community as a former suspect, so it's still sus. Corporal punishment such as whipping or beating was administered for these certain crimes, and the severity of the physical punishment might correspond to the seriousness of the offense. Number 2. Capital punishment. Law asserted its autonomy as early as the age of the pyramids, whereas the role of religion in legal matters began to diminish. Religion then no longer determined the legal standing of a matter, but it was rather a judicial mechanism which became authoritative, even in the religious sphere. Capital punishment, including execution, was reserved for the most severe crimes such as killing somebody. The methods of execution would include hanging, drowning, or other forms of judicial killings. Against most of these really depend on the severity of these crimes. And finally, of course, number 1, which is the death penalty. I mean, obviously, if you kill someone, you're met in the court of law based on which country you're in, and if you're in Canada, if you commit manslaughter, you might have to face, in the level of seriousness, up to 10 years. In the US, it's up to 25, but of course, in the prison systems vary and depends on what the clause was, as well as on good behavior and then parole. But in ancient Egypt, they appreciated the sanctity of life and respected it, which made them use the death penalty in order to not violate the sanctity, so the divide between killing and manslaughter, as an example, had to be made in order to preserve the non-violation of the death penalty. The death penalty was more for intentional killings and even resulted to psychological sanctions that were viewed more severe than execution. For example, if a parent killed their young, the body of the killer was then tied to the corpse of the victim for 3 days until the moment of decomposition, all while under the protection of guards and burning alive for young killings of their parents. It was also more of a warning to anyone who threatened to kill anyone, and even given the option that if you committed death on yourself and take your own life was apparently a gift granted to those who are sentenced to death. Well, Crime and Punishment had a quote that goes, "The man who has a consciousness suffers while acknowledging his sin, that is his punishment."
Number 5. Forced confession. In ancient Egypt, they had a well put together system of laws and a group that essentially acted as police. But that doesn't mean things were really all that fair. Just like in older European societies, forced confessions out of people was incredibly common. In fact, it was basically standard practice. Usually to elicit confessions, people would be whacked with sticks, often on the bottom of the feet. Those who were forced into confessing were expected to not only admit to what they did, but explain where anything they stole might still be hidden and rat out every single one of their accomplices. Then, the same practice could be applied to those accomplices. Unfortunately, like many imperfect legal systems, it will never be possible to quantify just how many innocent people may have been punished for a crime because they were forced into confessing, something that they didn't do. Sadly, false confessions under this method are an incredibly common phenomenon because people will do almost anything to just make it stop. Number 4, just leave her alone. When a man passed away in ancient Egypt, he was embalmed right away. Women, on the other hand, were a different matter. By law, the beautiful and the powerful weren't sent to embalmers until they had been in the afterlife for 3 to 4 days. This was all because nobody trusted the embalmers. This wasn't just paranoia though. It was something that the Egyptians learned the hard way. An embalmer left in charge of mummifying a royal body was caught in the act by a co-worker. We learned this from the following passage in Herodotus, which you can take with a grain of salt if you want to, but it went like this. Quote, "The wives of men of rank when they pass are not given at once to the embalmed, nor such women as are very beautiful or of greater regard than others, but on the third or fourth day after their passing, and not before, they are delivered to the embalmers. They do so about this matter in order that the embalmers may not..." I'll just leave the rest up to your own imagination. Number 3, crocodile dung. The ancient Egyptians were the first society we know of to create birth control. However, this birth control was not in the form of pills or little rubber things. Instead, the Egyptians turned to crocodiles, specifically their rear ends. To avoid pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians mixed honey and crocodile dung and then inserted that lovely mixture into the holiest of holies before any of the fun began. The reason for this is possibly that the acidity of crocodile poopy is considered to be effective at eliminating a man's microscopic soldiers of fortune. That is the best way I could have said that. Number 2, hippopotamus. Surprisingly little is known about the life of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, but some historians believe they know how he got a ticket to the afterlife. Scans of the young king's body show that he was embalmed without his heart or his chest wall. This drastic departure from traditional Egyptian burial practices could suggest many different things, but one hypothesis is that he may have suffered a horrific injury prior to his passing. According to a handful of Egyptologists, one of the most likely causes for this wound would have been a bite from a hippopotamus. Now, I don't know if you know, but hippos are actually extremely dangerous. But evidence indicates that the Egyptians hunted the beasts for sport, and statues found in King Tut's tomb even depict him in the act of throwing a harpoon. If the boy pharaoh was indeed fond of stalking the dangerous game, then the end of his life might have been the result of a hunt gone wrong. And finally, in at number 1 today, kitty shield. It's no secret that ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cats, and even worshipped them. When a cat lays down to its eternal rest, every member of the mourning family would shave their eyebrows in sorrow. If someone took the life of a cat, they were thrown into a poisonous snake pit, rightly so. After a cat passed on, it was mummified and buried in the cat cemetery with a bowl of milk next to it to prevent them from being thirsty in the afterlife. They also trained them to be vicious exterminators of pests that infiltrated food storage, allowing an agricultural society to dominate the Mediterranean. This was great. I love cats too, but it may have actually been part of the reason the Egyptians suffered a horrible defeat. Cats were so precious that when the Persians showed up using cats as shields, the Egyptians retreated in fear of taking the life of a cat. So the Persians took out tons of soldiers, the pharaoh, and took over the rule of Egypt.
In Detroit. Hi, my name is Jessa. Let's look at the top 10 messed up ancient Egyptian laws. Number 10, Ma'at's rules. Ma'at is the goddess of justice, as she and her scale balance between one's heart and a feather, and if yours weighed more than the feather, then you were met with the dark afterlife. But if your heart was equal to the feather, you would continue your journey into the afterlife. As for the principles of Ma'at, she had 42 laws that of the ancient Egyptians would follow if most, as there were other tribes as well who had their own following, had a specific distinction in society. Most, if not all, were pretty reasonable, but one in one of the 42 rules was a little odd. The rule was, I have not felt sorrow without reason. The rest of the rules were pretty great, as it includes I made no one cry today, I have not stolen food from a child, I have not stolen anyone's land, I have not polluted the water. Those are pretty great rules, but the not have felt sorrow without reason does borderline on the whole mental health set of things. Unless you're melancholy all the time, the concept of mental health was still a foreign concept, and even now, there are still people who do not believe it to be a rational feeling. As times go on, in this law in particular perhaps was not only referencing to the sake of ancient Egyptian mental health, but if someone was feeling depression or anxious or just not normal, they might have been ostracized or even looked with disdain. Number 9, fines. I mean, the concept of fines came pretty prevalent in these times, especially if theft and burglary occurred, which, as we know, grave robbing was pretty common. With that being said, the court had no power to ensure the judgment was fulfilled and instead actually relied on social pressure. The guilt had to be admitted and the judgment would be accepted. Oracles of the gods could also be approached to judge cases, so the assailant or the assumed accused, the penalty for stealing the property of individuals was up to paying a fine of 2 or 3 times the stolen object, which sounds pretty decent or very precedent in regarding of current times. As for theft of public property, however, as an example, the thief would be told to pay up to 180 times the amount of the stolen goods, or goods in general. The accused would be ordered to return the stolen goods after his full confession, which, by the way, as we understand in some cases, are beaten out of them, and they would be subjected to be beaten again, anyway, by 100 strokes by hand and swearing an oath, or thrown into a river for crocodiles to eat, and the sentence would be sentence in full public display for everyone to see. Number 8. Bribery clause. If you were caught bribing, especially if you're in state administrative work, you would be 100% brought to trial and punished. And by punished by dismissal from office, and your status would just be turned into a farmer. Bribery played a negative role in crippling the entire administrative process to the point where the government clerks would steal a file proving the conviction of one of the accused from the judicial archives. Many criminals, like thieves and grave robbers of the tomb of a king during a reign of Ramesses IX, were freed after paying said bribe. So even if the laws in ancient Egypt were pretty intense and a strict notion of punishment of being caught, seems like if you were in a high political office and you were caught bribing, not much would happen to you and you would be sent to court as an equal punishment like that of a civilian. You would just be turned into a civilian. Just like seeing a politician who runs for political office and them losing and then seeing them at Walmart the next day. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. But it's not a surprise someone in high positions would just get a slap on the wrist, or even in this case just a demotion. Number 7. Infidelity. Like in most societies, adultery or infidelity has always been looked down on. In ancient Egypt, adultery was considered a religious crime. The death penalty was also looked into this as used to prevent the spread of immortality in society. In the teachings of Ptah, he warns not to be fascinated by women and be careful from approaching women, as that's why thousands of men were perished. It's because of women's fault. When it comes to adultery with married women, it was a crime of deserving death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. So you can't commit another crime if you're dead, and if the crime is caused by a married woman, then her husband has the legal right to forgive or punish his wife, or just leave it to the court to punish the wife with no proof. The punishment of the man, who was a lot more lighter than the women of the ancient Egyptians, felt the offense of a promiscuous woman was more of her fault. While the women would be suffering several deaths, the men would just suffer severe beatings, and including the Ma'at's 42 laws, it is also mentioned, "I have not seduced anyone's wife" on the list, but if you do seduce, you are met with punishment. Just like the other way around on seducing husbands, just like Mae West once said, "Why don't you find a single one and leave the husbands alone?" Number 6. Penalty for treason. In life and all of human history, nothing is more vile than treason. Treason of one's family, one's friendships, treason to your nation, and even treason to yourself. But in ancient Egyptian times and law, when it comes to treason, it was met with one and only option, and that was death, execution style. And this was the only imposed penalty regarding the social status of the accused, especially if the majority of the defendants were close to the king. When King Ramesses III chose an heir to his throne, and this created a jealousy amongst his wives, especially a middle-class wife called T, who plotted to assassinate him to make her son the king. The wife and all the conspirators were caught, prosecuted, and punished, and considering there were no cemeteries for anyone to commit a crime against the majesties, the bodies would just be thrown into the river for the crocodiles to eat.
Number 10. Hathor. The goddess Hathor was originally created by her dad, Ra, as a destroyer of men. She was supposed to punish all those who were disobedient to him. But then Ra was like, nah, I don't really like that idea. He just kind of changed his mind and decided to make her the exact opposite. Instead, the goddess of love. But she kind of loved killing men, and like even he couldn't stop her. So one night he gave her what was supposed to be a mug of ale, but actually made it like a special kind of blood, and she got so drunk off of it that she got too tired out to kill anymore and therefore became the goddess of love. Drunk in love, am I right? Her cult was centered in Dendera, where she was also seen as the goddess of fertility and childbirth. When the Greeks occupied Egypt, they compared her with the goddess Aphrodite. But unlike the voluptuous woman Aphrodite was depicted as, Hathor came in 3 forms, and I bet you can't guess which. She was depicted as either a woman with a cow's ears, wearing the headdress of a cow, or just a cow. Moo. Number 9. The beginning of the world. What an inventive way to imagine the beginning of things. I mean, the Big Bang is still pretty crazy too, but hey, here we go. Freaking love how much magic is in these stories. Like, I'm in, because that's all there was at the beginning of the universe according to the ancient Egyptians. Just swirling darkness, chaos, and magic. Heka, the god of magic, was the only thing that existed, waiting for the opportune moment to begin. Then a hill showed up called Ben Ben, and out of which the god Atum erupted from. He was lonely, so he mated with his own shadow to give birth to 2 children, Shu and Tefnut. Shu gave life, Tefnut gave order. They left their father to build the world, but they were gone so long he took out his eye and sent it to search for them. In the meantime, he just kinda sat there contemplating eternity all alone. He was really sad. This guy sounds like Zeus mixed with Eeyore. Anyways, his kids came back and he was so happy he wept tears of joy, and out of which were born men and women. They also brought his eye back, so that was nice. Number 8. Light as a feather. So unlike a lot of religions we've heard of, there wasn't really a concept of hell in Egyptian mythology. It was either you were worthy of heading into the afterlife or you weren't. Mat was the goddess of harmony and supported the belief that if harmony was disrupted, it must be restored. Every ancient Egyptian myth in some form follows this format. But the most important role she played was in the afterlife. When the soul left the body, it would appear in the Hall of Truth in order to stand judgment before Osiris. The heart would be weighed on a golden scale against Mat's white feather. If the heart was heavier, it would be devoured by a monster and the soul would disappear. If it was lighter, then you could go live in eternal bliss. So instead of several layers of burning torment, souls in Egypt instead faced eternal darkness and unconsciousness. The idea of non-existence was more terrifying than being cut up by demons. Number 7. Osiris and Isis. Okay, so we aren't strangers to deities being a fan of incest. It was kind of like how they multiplied, and ancient Greeks were okay with it, but they kind of weren't. Anyways, the Egyptian gods were no exception. Isis and Osiris were 2 of the 4 children of the goddess of Nut. Isis and Osiris were married and actually really in love. They dug each other. When Osiris rose to the throne as the eldest sibling, his brother Set was pretty jealous. So he took the life of his own brother, cut him into little pieces, and scattered them all over Egypt. He really wanted to make sure the guy was dead. But then Isis wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. She had great magical powers capable of restoring life. She collected all of the pieces of her brother/husband and breathed life back into him. Osiris returned to life and they made all the love and then soon conceived a child named Horus. However, Osiris couldn't return to the land of the living, so he had to stay and rule over the underworld. So his son Horus was left to get revenge, and we'll get to that later. Number 6. Anubis. Now, I think in Western films that depict ancient Egypt, like The Mummy Returns, the god Anubis is often associated with the underworld. You know, that creepy half-man, half-jackal creature who appears to walk out of your nightmares? He's so creepy. Well, he did used to run the underworld until Osiris took over, but he was actually the god of mummification and the afterlife. So, not wrong, but not the whole story. Anubis was the son of Nephthys and Set. Well, kind of. Nephthys actually never conceived the child with Set. She kind of had the hots for Osiris. So she disguised herself as Isis and made love to him that way, and then Anubis came to life. That may have been one of the reasons Seth attacked Osiris in the first place, as his suspicions rose. But it was actually Anubis who helped Isis piece together Osiris, creating the first mummy. Fun fact, during the Greek rule of Egypt, Anubis and Hermes were seen kind of as the same, the people who ferried the dead to the underworld. Oh, sorry, and a point. Anubis was actually the one who weighed people's hearts, so he used the feather, the thing, you know what to do. He was responsible for doing that.
Number 5. Lord Nefertiru. For this next piece of evidence, we'll be directing our focus to the land down under. Australian aliens, baby, let's do it. In the Brisbane Water National Park, to be specific. Egyptian hieroglyphs educate us on our past. There's still so much we don't know, but it's fun to find UFO-looking objects within them. It's fun to speculate, as we are right now. But when Egyptian texts appear around the world in the middle of nowhere, those UFO hieroglyphs get a bit more concerning. Like the Gosford glyphs, for example. Discovered in the 1970s at Karyong, there's around 300 engravings spread over 2 sandstone walls. The hieroglyphs are strikingly similar to that of Egypt's. There's birds, even the markings of a scarab, which are those Milky Way poop pushers that I just talked about earlier. Egyptologist Raymond Johnson believes that this is the burial site of Egyptian royal family member Lord Nefertiru, who met his fate around 2600 BC, with some panels telling the story of 2 prince brothers who came from Egypt and subsequently became shipwrecked. But other panels get into the extraterrestrial goodness. Some of these Gosford glyphs have UFO shapes, with scarabs, birds, and sun symbols popping up as well. Maybe we did have alien aid when it came to laying these royal family members to rest. Number 4. Userkaf. Remember earlier when I was talking about those extremely heavy granite coffins? Well, the Sun Temple in Egypt may give us more alien clues as to their purpose. Discovered in 1842, this was the base of a giant monument that apparently used to stand over 150 feet tall. Built by the pharaoh Userkaf, founder of the 5th dynasty of Egypt, the temple translates to stronghold of Ra. Ra being the sun god. This temple at Abu Ghraib was home to one of the world's largest monoliths, and its purpose may blow your mind. This obelisk was built out of granite. Now they made things out of granite back then because it contained quartz. Quartz, due to piezoelectricity, was able to convert the Earth's vibrations into energy. Nikola Tesla did something similar. He figured out standing waves, which was the ability to pass energy through the air. Perhaps these granite monoliths were used to teleport people or goods. That would explain the last point about those Australian glyphs. To be fair, I have zero idea how Bluetooth works either. Alien airdropped in Egypt. I'm here for this theory. Number 3. Khufu. In order to become a god in the afterlife, these kings would build massive temples or pyramids. The Giza pyramids were built over 4,500 years ago, and to this day, they draw in about 15 million visitors a year. Pharaoh Khufu's is the largest pyramid in Giza, and it was the first pyramid that they started to build, obviously taking the longest. Reaching up to 147 meters high, it took 2.3 million rocks to create this landmark, and its alignment with Orion's belt gives it an extraterrestrial vibe. And with Tesla CEO Elon Musk tweeting aliens built the pyramids, obvi, we now have to ask, just how did thousands of workers achieve this? The placement of the pyramid is also unique as well. It's aligned perfectly with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. That much accuracy back then with the stars and the earth and the heavens, they must have gotten help from alien friends, or else they had the world's biggest protractor. Number 2. King Tut. Only a few years after King Tut's tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings, archaeologist Howard Carter found 2 daggers that were buried with said king. It's not uncommon to be buried with your goods. It's why Egyptians would build these tombs in a certain way, so that grave robbers wouldn't snoop around and steal your entire family heritage. It was made so nothing could get out, which is insane. But 2 daggers were found with King Tut, one made of iron and the other gold. Now, with iron being even more rare than gold in the Bronze Age, this was a big deal. And with recent advancements in technology, we were able to use a technique called portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, and according to the journal Meteorites in the Planetary Science, the blade is actually made of iron, nickel, and cobalt, suggesting that this material is of extraterrestrial origin. And finally, number 1. The Great Pyramid of Cholula. There are many parallels between Egyptian and Maya civilizations. The two cultures are so far apart both in time and distance, and they also never made contact, but both pyramids are made with steps and both have stone serpents. The vault arches are also strikingly similar, and hieroglyphs within share a lot of the same symbolism. These hieroglyphs include advanced mathematics that they say was bestowed upon them, also from these sky gods. Kicking off the list at number 10, KV55. Located in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, Tomb 55, otherwise known as KV55, was found by Edward Arden back in 1907. It was discovered right next to King Tut's tomb, and the reason we call this tomb by a number rather than name is because we really don't know who was inside it yet. Even the walls outside of the tomb, they aren't covered with any hieroglyphs to tip us off or give us any hints. It's just bare, which is kind of eerie. As you walk down the 20 steps towards KV55, you'll notice markings on the entrance, markings that show that the entrance was widened since it was first cut, along with its ceilings being raised higher. So whatever was in there needed the room. The only hint as to who was buried remains on the walls. One hieroglyph remains, and it was discovered in 1907, and it translates to "the evil one that shall not live again." Even these massive stones were built in order to prevent anything from getting out. See, usually with these ancient tombs, it's the opposite. The description for who's inside the tomb had also been destroyed. So we have no idea who or what is in KV55. Number 9, King Teti. The Pyramid of Teti was built for the first ruler of the 6th dynasty, and while it's not flashy or massive as these other pyramids, the insides contain the oldest writing in the religious world. Pretty insane. Now these texts go back to 2400 BC, way back when we used, BBM. The pyramid texts were specifically written so that this King Teti could ascend to the heavens after his death. There are spells and incantations meant to free the king's soul and arrive in the cosmos, more specifically for Teti to become a star in the sky and then join Osiris and Orion in the God Squad. There's even instructions on how to preserve the body and travel to said heavens. World's oldest instruction manual for the win. Number 8, Queen Nefertiti. After a scan was done on King Tut's tomb, there were cracks found on the north and earth walls. East, Taylor, east, not earth. There were cracks found on the north and east side walls, so we believe that this is a secret passageway to Queen Nefertiti, the ruler during the 14th century BC, and also wife to King Tut. Queen Nefertiti's parents are also still unknown to this day, so that adds to it. And with ancient texts depicting that these kings and queens would leave Earth and then later return, perhaps they are both descendants of extraterrestrials. And this flying sun disk that they worshipped was not the sun, but rather a winged alien ancestor. Number 7, Dozer. For this one, we're looking into some bull worshipping, so grab your red scarves and start waving them around. Just north of the step pyramid of the Pharaoh Dozer, archaeologist Auguste Marionnet discovered this site in 1851. The Serapeum is a temple dedicated to the Egyptian deity Serapis, a combination of Osiris and Apis in human form. Now, this was a large burial ground for the Apis bulls. They were basically these bulls that were said to be sacred, and after their death, they would become immortal. Remember that, that's important. Today at Saqqara, there's this massive vault. It's 382 yards long and it's carved out of sandstone bedrock. It's massive, and along the sides of them are 24 chambers, each with sarcophagus carved out of a single chunk of granite. Now inside these boxes were animal remains, just bones and all. But back then in those times, you weren't allowed to break up any bodies. That was a no-go. You had to mummify them. So how are these tombs built, first of all, so perfectly, weighing over 80 tons, and where do these bones come from? Perhaps these are the remains of the Apis bull. After all, that's the inspiration for the Minotaurs, so maybe alien ancestors looked a lot more jacked than we may think. Number 6, dung beetles. This one isn't exactly a pharaoh at all, but it's too good to leave out, especially if we're talking about aliens here. It's important. Dung beetles, also known as scarabs, are the only species in the entire world that follows the Milky Way. Think about that for a second. Let's talk about it. Some animals follow the sun. Turtles sprint to the ocean the second they're born to avoid getting plucked up by birds. Now these insects would follow the line of the Milky Way and then roll their towards it. Literally, their poop, they would roll it towards the skies, which is insane. Symbols of these beetles are seen all over, either in hieroglyphics or even in movies. Their presence is known. Near the sacred lake at the Temple of Karnak, there's a massive scarab monument. And there's even a legend still to this day behind said statue that if you walk around it 9 times, you would find health, wealth, and love. And you'd also probably be a little bit dizzy. The scarab is there to represent the god Khepri, which at the time Egyptians believed was the sun as well. Also known as the scarab-faced god, which terrifying when you imagine that. Are these bugs just trying to get home into space to their bug alien master? Why does he need so much poop? Whatever DIY project they're working on in the Milky Way probably doesn't smell too good.
Number 5, Horus and Set. Speaking of Horus, earlier, remember how I said Horus had to take over defending his father? Well, here is where this story begins. When Horus grew up to be a man, he pulled a Hamlet. He was like, "You killed my father, prepare to die." Thus a series of battles ensued, and one of the gods didn't play fair. Set kept cheating at everything and continued to come out as victor. Not surprising since he didn't earn his way on the throne, he killed for it, kind of like a certain Claudius. Eventually Isis stepped out to help her son/nephew overcome her brother. She set a trap for Set, but after some pitiless begging for his own life, she let him go. Horus was pissed, so angry some of the other gods got upset that he was so angry. They agreed to compete in a final boat race, and Horus was like crushing it. He was doing really well, he was about to win, but then of course Set cheated by turning into a hippopotamus and attacked the boat, therefore claiming victory once again. Osiris finally showed up and declared that no man should take the throne through murder. So Horus took the throne. Why Osiris didn't just settle the whole deal from the beginning is confusing in itself, but hey, kinda reminded me of the eagles that showed at the end of Lord of the Rings that could have saved like 3 movies, Kinda like that. Anyways, let's move on. Number 4, Ra and his boat. Ra is one of the most revered gods in Egyptian mythology, especially since he was the god of the sun. He was depicted as a man with the head of a falcon. That kind of makes sense. He was once the greatest of all gods, but had to take a step back after he got too old and tired, and especially considering his task, I can see why. His job was to drive away darkness and sail across the skies, delivering light wherever he went. But at night, he would dive into the underworld and have to cross 12 gates. 12 hours, an hour per gate. After paying his respect to Osiris every night, a giant snake named Apophis tried to attack and swallow the boat. Every night! Poor guy, no wonder he got worn out. Every day it got harder to defend, and even one night, Apophis succeeded, but could only hold the sunlight for so long. She threw it up, which explained solar eclipses. After Set was cast out after the whole nephew battle, he ended up serving Ra in his boat and kept the snake at bay, but there's something confusing coming later that I think you'll agree is very confusing, so here we go. Coming up next we have Bast, number 3. Have you ever had a cat look you up and down and kind of like expect something? Like worship, Are you a cat person? Dog person? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's because cats were a big deal in Egyptian mythology. They even had their own goddess. Bastet was a cat goddess depicted as a woman with a cat's head. Cats had a meaningful role in ancient Egypt as they protected their food from rats and snakes. They were even seen as family members, and to harm one was punishable by death. Legend says that sometimes cats would enter burning buildings to save their families. If they died, the goddess would bring them back to life, hence the idea of cats having 9 lives. There it is. Now here's where things get confusing. You know that story I told about Ra? Well, apparently Bastet was in the boat with him as well. During the day she would ride with him, and at night she would turn into a cat and then defend the boat from Apophis the snake. But I thought that was Set. So many conflicting things. I saw like a couple different stories who said each thing was different, so who knows. Number 2, Jeb and Nut. Yet another sibling partnership, we have Jeb and Nut. They fell deeply in love and could never be separated. They were that couple who would like constantly be like, oh my god, stop, right next to each other at dinner, you know what I mean? Jeb was the god of the earth and Nut was the god of the sky. A previously mentioned god, Tum, found their union inappropriate, so he pushed Nut into the sky far away from Jeb. He just didn't like being a third wheel. Jeb and Nut were close enough to see each other, but could never hold each other again. And she gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Some say Horus too, but I don't think that's true. Number 1, the treasure thief. Okay, I don't know how I feel about this story, okay? This doesn't really feel like harmony is in balance, but anyways. The treasure thief ends in a way I really didn't expect, and I'm not sure you will either. Long ago, a great pharaoh with a wealth of riches decided to build a pyramid in which to keep them safe. One of the builders was wise to his plan and decided to find a way to claim them for himself. He built a stone vault with a hidden entrance covered by a slab so he could get to the riches. But unfortunately, he fell ill before he could return, so he told his sons of his plan. The sons headed to the pyramid in the dead of night, following their father's order. But, unbeknownst to them, the pharaoh had laid booby traps and one brother was caught in one. Not wanting to be found or interrogated, revealing his other brother, he told his brother to chop his head off. Ugh, that he did. Loyalty? I don't know. The pharaoh, upon finding the body, hung it up in the town square in the hopes of like weeding out whoever's it belonged to. But the other brother, being so clever, got the guards drunk and stole back his brother's body in the dead of night. The pharaoh was like, I'm not even mad, I'm just impressed. He gave the thief a pardon, summoned him to the square, and gave his daughter to marry him. Yeah dude, you tried to steal my jewels? Don't worry about it. Have my daughter, because you're so talented at your job. Great work.